Okay, should we kick off?
Let's do it.
Great. So, hi everyone. Welcome to our event, A Day in the Life of a CRO with Jennifer Geary. Welcome, Jenny. The agenda for today is very simple. I'll just tell you a little bit about CWSI for a couple of minutes and how we help manage cyber and technology risk, how it affects people, brand, reputation, financial and compliance. And then myself and Jenny, this is the bulk of the session, we'll go through the foundations of the CRO role, the culture, the strategy and the execution. So we'll discuss, like the different types of risks and categories outlined in the book, and how to address them, and there'll be time for questions at the end, so you can either type a question into the Teams chat window, or if you want to click on the little reactions button up the top there and raise a hand, we can unmute your mic and you can ask the question in person. Okay, so just a little bit about us first, if that's all right. Just go to that slide. So CWSI is an 11-year-old company. We were founded in Dublin and we've expanded very rapidly since then. So in the last 2 years, we've acquired 3 companies and pretty much tripled our headcount. We acquired AVR in the UK, Bloud in the Netherlands, and Mobco, who are based in Belgium and Luxembourg. So in total, we have 125 employees with 5 European territories. So we're truly a pan-European company with global customers, right? The background for CWSI was mainly around UEM and device security for a long time. And we've expanded our portfolio and our expertise into the cybersecurity and compliance space in a big way. So we do a lot around identity and access management and risk around credential theft and identity theft and access controls, conditional access and stuff like that. UEM in particular, we have a lot of expertise around device provisioning and device security, EDR and XDR, and importantly, and we'll touch on some of these areas in today's discussion, a lot of experience working with regulatory bodies and with highly regulated organizations who are looking to use a framework or move to a compliance standard around NIST CIS, ISO 27001, and of course the NCSC cybersecurity framework for public sector. So we do a lot of work around data management, governance of Teams, OneDrive and SharePoint, cloud resources, permissions management, the joiners, movers, leavers process, etc., data sensitivity labeling, and all that good stuff. So what we do as a company is we take a very structured approach to figuring out what an organization needs in terms of addressing risk and applying the right technology and processes, and people are a very important factor in that, and adoption processes and communication is very important. So we conduct security assessments, implement design solutions, manage the deployment, and then we will provide a managed service to back end that. So we're very much a consulting services and managed services company, a service oriented organization. So that's us. I tried to wrap it into a really quick 2-minute introduction to CWSI. There will be contact details at the end of the session if you want to get in touch with us to talk about anything you're concerned about in terms of cyber and technology risk. And of course, we'll be touching on that as part of our discussion with Jenny about her book. So just to introduce Jenny, Jennifer is a COO with over 25 years of experience in finance, technology, risk and legal. She's worked across diverse industries from financial services to not-for-profit, and she's the author of the book we'll be talking about today, How to Be a Chief Risk Officer, which is doing really well on Amazon. And yeah, the book demystifies the CRO role by breaking it into constituent parts and outlining requirements that have kind of changed in recently. So everyone today will get a free copy of her book. So we'll send that on to you. We should have your contact details from your registration form. And without further ado, I'd like to introduce Jenny. So welcome, Jenny. Thank you very much for joining us.
Thank you, Tom, for having me.
So just to ask, I suppose, with an obvious question, what made you decide to write the book? Like, how did it come about?
Yeah, so as you mentioned, I have a background, 25 years in financial services as a COO and CRO. So I've done both of those roles. And 5 years ago, I wrote about the role of chief operating officer, which I felt that was a role that needed to be broken down and needed to be explained. And I also felt the same with Chief Risk Officer. The risk discipline, I guess, is around for probably a little over 20 years from when the sort of Basel pillars and AMA supervision and all of those things came in. And there is no shortage of writing about risk management out there, but a lot of it is very, very scholarly. It's very, very hard to get a sense of, and it's not very accessible. And I felt there was still space for a book that was pretty digestible. It's an easy read in a weekend. It's not, it's not too sort of lengthy and that kind of thing. But it covers, first of all, as you've mentioned, exactly culture, strategy, and execution, because I think they're the foundation pillars of any C-suite role. Then we go into the top 20 or so operational risks that most organizations will face to a greater or lesser extent. And then finally, I talk about some of the things through my lived experience, such as how to build your team, how to build diversity of talent and skill sets in your team, and how to leverage technology so that you can stay focused on what the risks are that really matter. So yeah, I felt there was a space for it, and it seems to be going down well so far.
Yeah, I've seen a big uplift, especially since our event last week, obviously, in interest in the book, which is great, and long may it continue. So I'm curious, what has changed in recent times about the role of the CRO, and I suppose anything that you can highlight in the book that highlights that change, I suppose.
Yeah, absolutely. There are definitely some bits, and as I reflect on the book I wrote 5 years ago versus what's changed now, there are definitely some risks that have evolved or come to the fore a little bit more. So, for example, I spoke about facilities management 5 years ago, and that has changed completely from what it was before. So now we have co-working spaces. We've basically turned massive 20 and 30-year fixed leases into premises as a service, right? So facilities management has changed massively, and we've been able to outsource an awful lot of the management around that. I also think the areas of people and culture have changed hugely. If you think about the focus that we have now on mental health, on culture, the Me Too movement, Black Lives Matter, this focus on workplaces and can they be toxic or can they be nurturing? I think there's a huge space there that has evolved that I speak to in the book now, now versus a few years ago. There's two others. One, I write about sustainability because that is just something that now is becoming so foundational to everything that people that we do as people and as organizations. How sustainable is our business model? How sustainable are our business practices? And then finally, of course, there are the changes in technology. And again, I think 5 years ago, I wrote about the fact that there was this thing coming to the fore. It was cloud. It looked interesting. And of course, things have changed and moved so much since then. The fabulous thing is we now get to, if we're deploying in cloud, we now get to outsource a whole ream of things we used to have to think about, like hot failovers, like offsites, like backups, which just get handled for us by the cloud providers. But that's also not to say that we have completely removed risk in that space, because now we have to start to think about which cloud providers we use and how reliant are we on them, and is there concentration risk around them, and so on. So yeah, it's definitely improved, but we have traded one set of considerations for another.
And we found as a company as well that the prevalence of cloud use, especially in the last 2 years, obviously, as a collaboration tool, allows for certain risks like oversharing, oversharing of potentially sensitive data, and you have to embark on a journey then of kind of making people aware of the risks of sharing that data, what to look out for in terms of what sensitive data looks like, and how to handle that. And if you can introduce some automation without asking them to do too much work, that helps too. So, what are your thoughts around that? Around kind of the cloud as an enabler, but also as a risky kind of utility, I suppose.
Completely, and I suppose it's the latest iteration, isn't it, of balancing user experience and security. And as people who've worked in security, we've always had to do that, right? People always grumbled about having to use a password or go through multiple layers of security and all that kind of thing. And this to me is just the latest iteration of that. But some of the tools and some of the experience has become so good, right? You know, what we expect to be able to do from the phone in our hand, the ease with which we expect to be able to work, can give rise, can't it, to a familiarity, a casualness in how we conduct ourselves. I think
I suppose you could call it the consumerization of technology in a way.
Yeah.
You know, the people expect to use their corporate phone as they would their personal phone, you know, their laptop. They probably want to do some gambling or look at Netflix, and some of that stuff is harmless, but some can introduce a certain level of risk.
And of course, you know, in the last 2 or 3 years, we have blurred, haven't we? Home and office. We've blurred where we work. We've blurred how we work. There's more of our personal lives, sitting alongside our professional lives, and it can be easy to forget. I mean, I think if you're a trader in the city, you always knew that trades needed to take place on recorded lines, in a very formalized way. And even in COVID, I know of, secure lines being installed in traders' homes so that they could continue to work in that way. So some professions have maybe always had that. But I think if you come from maybe less formal, less regulated sectors, media, tech, and so on, it's very easy to forget and to not think about where those conversations are taking place and where they might subsequently surface at a different time.
Yeah, very good point. So there's a lot to think about, and it can be kind of overwhelming. Obviously in your book you split it out into sections. Strategy, people, technology, etc. So strategy is at the very top as the first consideration. Why did you put that there, and can you kind of expand on why you would look at strategy first?
Maybe Kate, you can just pop up the pyramid just so I can speak to it for a second. So as I looked at the different risks that organizations face, it struck me that there was a hierarchy, and I guess I don't mean a hierarchy of importance, because I don't want people to say to me, oh, does this mean that credit risk is less important than cyber risk and that sort of thing? And no, you do have to think about them all, but in terms of an order in which you think about them. So the first thing I always talk about is strategy and strategic risk. And as an incoming CRO, the first and most important thing I think you need to do is to satisfy yourself on both the design and the execution of strategy. So, the organization that you're joining, the organization that you're becoming CRO of, how well formed is their strategy? How cognizant is it of the external market and the changing market? How clear-eyed is it about how the company is going to be successful? And then, so that's strategic design, and then there's strategic execution, which is, well, how well is that strategy actually being put into action in the market? How well is it trickling down? How well is it communicated? Do people understand it? And I start with that very deliberately, because if you haven't got that, if you haven't understood, or if the organization hasn't got that really rock solid, frankly, all of the other work to manage risk is ultimately not going to be that successful, because the strategy of the organization, you're sort of holed beneath the waterline. So I start with that one very, very consciously. Then I talk an awful lot about people, and I talk about culture, because the culture is that sort of that ethereal thing that basically forms a difference between success and failure, and culture as it relates to risk. And I might be, sorry Tom, running ahead and preempting another question, but risk culture, how do you set a risk-aware culture? How do you set one that means that people understand how leadership feel? How is the rest of the C-suite, not just you, how are they standing up and how are they talking about working within the guidelines that have been set about risk management, about being risk aware, and about being alert. So those things I put at the very, very top, because again, it's not about relative importance. It doesn't mean you can ignore the others, but to me, you've got to start with those fundamental things.
Okay, thank you. And we touched on people, but I think it's quite important. There was a very interesting question that came out of last week's discussion in Dublin, and it was around kind of you can embed technology, obviously, and that can fix certain problems, but it can also, as you said, ask employees to take extra steps and do extra things, and maybe they feel like Big Brother is watching a little bit to a certain degree, you know, if they're asked to enroll their device, or if they're asked to, you know, click on another multi-factor authentication, or, you know, they're asked to do another phishing simulation training. So how do you make it consumable? How do you make it manageable, and highlight the value add, I guess, and not just kind of scare them and tell them about the technology?
We really have to work as risk professionals, don't we? We have to work to keep it fresh. I liken it a bit to, you know, the safety demonstration at the beginning of a flight, right? You know, and sort of this is how you fasten your seatbelt, and everyone is, you know, like you've lost the audience straight away. And we've all, you know, if you've been in the industry, I mean, how many of those videos have we watched? How many of those, you know, courses and simulations have we taken? And I think it is about keeping it relevant, keeping it up to date, explaining to people the why, you know, the why these things are so important. There was a story last week about one of the major banks that has been fined, I think, $35 million because they weren't disposing of their old laptops carefully. I mean, who thinks about what we do with all the old laptops, right? But what happened was they were you know, they were going back to the IT department. The IT department was selling them on to a third party, who then auctioned this hardware online to get some money for it. But there was still customer data on some of the laptops because they hadn't been properly wiped, right? You know, things, you know, we don't think about that, and I think that sort of horizon scanning, that storytelling, is what keeps people engaged and keeps people alert as to the things that could go wrong, and that there is genuinely a reason for these checks. It's not just layering bureaucracy.
A lot of these things are accidental, you know, they're not malicious. Some of them are malicious, obviously, you've got to be aware of that, but a lot of the risks that come out of phishing attacks, for example, it's because someone's clicked on a link because they thought it was a verified link, that it was something that they're used to seeing. They're just not aware that risk is there. You know, when they leave the company, they may have data on their laptop, and that laptop could be stolen, or the laptop could be exploited, or a phone, or anything like that. They're not aware that they're leaving with valuable company data, and that could be classed as a data breach. You know, there's a lot of awareness training, I think, that's required around that kind of stuff. So it's
and that there's personal liability potentially around that, as corporate implications, right?
Certainly, you have to be aware of their the risk to their personal data, their own personal data, you know, their personally identifiable data. They could have their identity stolen, as well as, you know, the stuff in their iCloud account or whatever it might be. So that's great to hear. You know, that there should be an approach, I suppose, to increasing awareness in a usable way. There's a balance, I think, to be struck between security posture and the end user experience. You know, it's hard to strike, but it's something we're constantly evolving. So we've covered tech a fair bit. Financial risk, if we can talk about that, and if you can expand on that. Obviously, there's financial risk associated to stuff that happens in cyber, such as the bank. You know, I'm sure the regulators, they were fined and stuff like that. What other financial risks can we talk about?
And just, I think, just to cover off on tech, we have obviously spoken about it a lot. I break it up, and obviously there's different ways of doing it. You know, technical risk is sort of, in the old world, it used to be kind of, you know, CIA, so, you know, confidentiality, integrity, and availability of technology. I think there's still value in thinking of it in that way. Cyber risk, obviously related to anything to do with engagement online, with indeed technology being available in the cloud. cloud, with the safety of your perimeter, whether even the concept of perimeter exists in a cloud environment. So, you know, there's a whole raft of considerations there. And then, of course, as you said, data privacy, you know, personal information, whether it's customer information, employee information, intellectual property of the organization, legal information, sensitive information, all that kind of thing. So those different pillars to think about. But yeah, on the financial side, obviously these risks have been around for a long time, and I think are probably some of the best understood and thought of when we think about risks. So, you know, capital, are you adequately capitalized to fund your operations in the medium to long term? Liquidity, do you have enough cash flow in the short term in order to fund your expenditure? Credit and counterparty risk, obviously very relevant to banks and those who lend money, financial services providers, but counterparty risk as well in terms of your counterparties, your legal counterparties, your suppliers, the people on whom you depend to fund to run your operations. There's a whole wealth of considerations there in terms of different counterparties. Market risk, we were talking, weren't we, Tom, last week about how we've sort of enjoyed, you know, 12 to 15 years of a relative, you know, since the crash, basically the last time, a relatively stable financial services environment, you know, low to very, very low interest rates, relatively stable FX rates, and my goodness, just look at what's happened in the last week, right? So things that we were able to rely upon before, like an expectation of low interest rates, which meant that investors applied very low discount factors to future cash flows. That's all changed. You know, how do we think about sterling at the moment relative to the markets and so on? You know, is this a short-term thing or is this a new normal? So all of a sudden, market risk is becoming a factor for organizations who maybe haven't had to worry about it very much for quite some time. So very, very topical there. And then financial reporting for the accountants in the room. This is the true and fair view. This is, you know, making sure that we have the systems, the technology, the processes to ensure that we're gathering and harvesting all the correct financial information and representing that correctly in the financial statements, which becomes ever more complex year after year.
Thanks, Jenny. Great answer. I don't know about financial risk too much, so I can't ask too many follow-up questions. But certainly, operational is very interesting, and it's quite broad. There's a lot in it, and there's certainly, you know, certainly a large enough section of your book to warrant further discussion. So, can you go through some of the elements that you've highlighted in your pyramid there, the operational risk, if that's okay?
So what I do with these in the book is I have a very short section on each, you know, what it is, you know, how it manifests, how it can go wrong for an organization, and what some of the key controls you would typically see in that space to mitigate against those risks. Obviously, it can't be all-encompassing because there's so much there, but just a sort of a start point, a frame of reference. Again, I'm sort of thinking about a new to role CRO, and as they're sort of going through that checklist in their mind of things like what could go wrong, what haven't I thought about, just, you know, just enough there to kind of think about. I think one really interesting one is model risk. So increasingly, we're using artificial intelligence and machine learning to help us make decisions, to help us look for trends, to help support, you know, even things as fundamental as whether to onboard a customer or whether to lend to them. And that whole area of model governance, you know, who designs the model, who oversees it, what are the 3 lines of defense along that whole kind of area of model governance? I think that's a really kind of interesting space, and I talk a bit about that as well. And very happy, you know, when we get to questions at the end to talk about, you know, dig into any of these that people are especially interested in. But yeah, just try to cover off. I can't say it's every single risk that an organization will face, but it's a pretty good start, I hope.
Yeah, thank you. How do you take this risk framework from theory to execution, Jenny? I suppose that's a complicated question with a long answer.
Yeah, absolutely. And again, you know, it depends on whether you are, building something from scratch or possibly more likely iterating something that's already there. So I was chief risk officer at a new fintech that Santander created. It was called Asto, and we had we had to set up everything from scratch, which was really interesting, hard work. Obviously, there was an awful lot to it, but because Santander was our parent, they had something like 270 policies, which we distilled down into 30 bite-sized, relevant, right-sized for a new organization policies. And that was a really powerful thing to do because, and we got it blessed by the powers that be in Santander. But what it meant was we had something that we could kind of work with, something that didn't kind of constrain us unduly, but still where we knew where the red lines were. So that was, I guess, it was a blessing and a curse. I think more a blessing, frankly, to have that framework that we could then kind of distill down. I think a really great thing for a new CRO to do, obviously you're going to want to inventory what's there at the moment, but I think using a framework, something like this, what you can do is it's very powerful to spend time with obviously the leadership team, with management teams, and with staff, to do that sort of, what are we missing? What are we not thinking of? What are the things that worry you? Because if there is a difference between those perceptions at different levels of the organization, that can really be quite insightful. That can tell you something about potentially things that are being missed along the way. And I think the other thing, of course, is you do benefit from an external point of view as well, from benchmarking with other organizations, with similar organizations in the industry, and also with cross-sector, just seeing what's going on elsewhere that may perhaps trickle into your world. So I think, taking that time, it's a powerful thing to do as a new CRO to spend time internally, but also looking externally. And there's some great, I'm sure, you've already mentioned, Tom, some of the frameworks, so in the data and tech and cyberspace. So, NIST, ISO 27001, whether or not you go all the way to getting that final certification is one thing, but there's such useful frameworks because what they do is they break down those risks. And, you may score, 4 out of 5 in one area, but a 1 out of 5 in another. And that tells you something about where you can focus your effort. And it also makes it much easier to justify budget spend and so on, and to put a sort of an 18-month plan in place or whatever to address some of the weaknesses. So, don't go it alone. There's plenty out there to help.
Yeah, and we find our customers are often using them as a guide rather than something to certify for, or that they may certify in a year or two, but they're using NIST, for example, as a guideline to benchmark certain security and compliance standards within the organization around identity, device, around threat detection and response, and protecting their data. So it's really useful to use some of those and to use the controls and standards with them as a baseline, and also to report back in documentation. Well, we're covered in these areas. We've got this far to go. So it's useful to help you roadmap, I suppose, a cyber security strategy over time.
And board members and investors, they love that because, A, they have the assurance that it's being benched to something recognizable. B, it's not a case of, everything's great or everything's terrible. It's kind of, it's showing focus and it's showing precision. And it provides them with a way to track progress and to be able to, and it gives, it can be quite stressful as a board member because you have this, this huge responsibility, and to be able to say, well, no, I'm feeling comfortable because, we've looked at it. And yes, there was a couple of areas, nobody's perfect, but we're working on those now, and I can see progress and that sort of thing. So it's really good for taking down the temperature, I think, and for settling the nerves.
Certainly, yeah, we found that, and to build an internal business case and to get buy-in from the organization, it certainly helps to have a standard and a benchmark to work from. So should you house all of your risk expertise within your organization? Like, when is it right to outsource, Jenny?
Yeah, great question. And again, it'd be so interesting to look at the people on this call and the size of organization that they work in and that they cover. I think, again, with the advent of the cloud providers, there came a recognition that it was going to be very, very hard to match the kind of investment in tech and in security that these absolute, mega giants can do. So one of the key things for me in making the leap from on-premise technology to cloud was, when my CTO sat me down and talked me through, look, think about this, like when we spin up a fresh instance in the cloud, it is brand new, it is patched, it is on all the latest versions of everything. It benefits from the billions of investment that Amazon, AWS, or Microsoft Azure, or whoever the provider is, does, and they have a budget that you can never even hope to match or to emulate, and sort of that realization that outsourcing, some of those risks becomes, almost a thing that you have to, like, why wouldn't you do that? It flips from kind of why would we to why wouldn't we do it? And I think the same thing applies when you think about technology risk expertise. And obviously, it very much depends on the size of your organization. If there are people here from large banks, they will have pretty huge technology budgets themselves, and they will be able to house more of that skill internally than others. So I think you've got to be cognizant about the industry in which you work, the size of the organization, the size of your budget, but everybody benefits from that external view. Everybody benefits from, as I mentioned before, the kind of benchmarking. I mean, there's some cool stuff happening in operational risk and technology risk now, whereby you can standardize how you talk about technology controls. You can be benched against others in the sector, and you can even sort of multiply that by a sort of losses in the sector related to that risk, and try and come up with these kind of synthetic potential loss calculations and so on, which basically give precision to kind of quite ephemeral things, and it allows you again to put forward a very strong case for investment in tech. So a long-winded answer, and I guess I'm coming around to saying it depends. But I do think as a new CRO coming into role, you probably want to be on a pretty solid footing as to how your organization is doing relative to others, and often that external view can be really helpful.
We find as well that there's increased external pressure from regulators, from cyber insurance providers. The questionnaires are getting longer and more complex, and that puts pressure on an organization, but it's hard to translate, let's say the recommendations from a cyber audit into achievable action. So that's quite often what we experience is helping organizations move from a list of issues and concerns and risks and compliance risk, and moving it into an actual execution plan. So
absolutely,
it's like, how do you take that external pressure and tone it down, make it achievable, phase it out, and roadmap it? In your view, what's the best approach for a chief risk officer to address that, I suppose?
Yeah, absolutely. That sense of, well, what do we do now? Great. We found all these things, and again, that's where that sort of expert view in terms of the relative priority of things can be really helpful. And I think also working with your team, I was a big fan as CRO when we were addressing technology issues to look at the longer list of risk issues and kind of say, well, look, kind of while we already, I used to use the phrase, while we have the patient on the table, might we also address some other things in this space at the same time? So it requires an intelligent application. It's I mean, broadly, of course, high priority to low priority and that sort of thing. But sometimes you can be thoughtful and say, well, look, while we're looking at this perimeter issue, maybe there's some more we can do in the space, or while we're addressing some user experience issues in the product here, actually there's an opportunity to inject some enhanced security or something like that. So it's always going to be a dialogue, and that's where the art is relative to the science. But yes, having someone with experience able to kind of say, look, I can see a pattern here. I can see that we're going to do this chunk of work first, and then we'll do that, and then we'll do the other. And of course, you never get to the bottom of the list because other risks and issues come in the whole time. So it's an evolving thing all the time. But that kind of constant reprioritizing, reassessment, it is very helpful to have, to have expertise there to help you do that. And I think you just said something else as well, which triggered something with me, that whole point of, I bet all of the people on here, if you're supplying software to financial services, or if you're a provider to somebody else, you probably are having to fill in those 400 questionnaires, right? About your security, about your technology, about your ESG credentials, and so on. And sometimes my hope would be that some of these external accreditations will in time short circuit some of that, to say, we are ISO 27001 certified, here's the certification, here's a report, here's an independent place that you can go to, because that is one of just the most torturous bits of doing business, and I have to believe there's a better way of doing it.
Yeah, and there's probably an approach to start looking at kind of process and behaviors as well, and kind of, if there's a point in time or a fork in the road where you can say, well, let's use this as an opportunity to change how we manage these processes and introduce some automation and reduce some complexity, because often you find that complexity in kind of manual processes and long-winded kind of back and forth, especially kind of transferring data via email, is an old one to look at. There's new and better ways to do things, with maybe some automation and some embedded security there. So
yeah, I mean, we've all had the experience where something has gone wrong, a risk event has taken place, and the response has been to layer a new checklist on top, right? And most of the time that is not going to be the answer. That's just adding, to the burden, and kind of diffusing the control environment a little bit more, as opposed to looking at, well, hang on, how can we make that process simpler, more streamlined? How can we embed system controls such that, hopefully they're invisible to the end user as far as possible. They're just happening in the background.
Yeah, absolutely.
And I think it takes me on to one of the themes, and I guess back to another reason why I wrote this book was, all too often, and we're probably sick of it in the risk industry, we're viewed as a brake on progress, we're viewed as a barrier to getting things done, that sort of sense of, well, we're going to have to get this through the risk team now, and that sort of thing. Whereas actually good risk, well designed, and I really liked something on one of your earlier slides, which was, I think it was like secure by design or something like that. The idea that good design up front actually acts as an enabler, as an empowerer, and having a sort of a risk framework where people know what the guidelines are but have freedom to operate within those guidelines is incredibly empowering for an organization. The best CRO I ever worked for, he had come from a front office revenue generating role, and he had moved into risk unusually, but he was very, very comfortable when we were looking at lending to a segment of the population, and he was like, well, how much could we lose on this business according to our business forecast? Okay, it's £1 million. Fine, you have freedom to operate up to £1 million. Let me know when we get to £500,000. Let me know when we get to £750,000. But off you go and grow the business. And that is just so enabling and empowering to an organisation to know, to have that freedom within a framework and to be able to operate. And I wish more risk management was like that.
Okay, great, thank you. Is there anything particular from the book that differentiates it from the other similar books in its category?
I think if you go onto Amazon and you look up sort of risk management books and that kind of thing, you will see plenty of very weighty scholarly academic tomes that are expensive in terms of time and money to consume through. And obviously that's not saying that there's not value in them. Of course there is. But I guess what I was trying to do with this book, as with the first one, is to create something that's born out of my real world experience, and that's born out of what I've seen in 25 years in the industry. But so that tells you kind of how it feels in the real world and the things that people worry about, but also to give you a sort of a flyby whistle stop of the areas, the things in first 100 days in a new role that I would think about and that I would want to check and that I would want to get through. So it's very applied. It's not theoretical at all. And hopefully that adds to the body of knowledge that's there, and maybe just gives it a slightly different angle.
Great, thanks very much. When's your next book coming out, Jenny? Have you got any in mind?
So I cannot, in all good conscience, I have been a COO and I've been a chief risk officer. I cannot, in all conscience, write any other C-suite books, but I have actually reached out to a CISO who I greatly admire and a chief people officer who I greatly admire, and maybe there's a future to co-authoring some further books on the C-suite role, but it will be their intel, not mine, for those ones.
Okay. How do you think the CRO role is going to change in the coming years? Do you see any kind of transitional change happening in the next 2 to 5 years?
Gosh, good question. I'm almost loath to answer, because if you'd asked me this question 2 to 5 years ago, I'm sure I wouldn't have called out all the things that have
changed.
So, yeah. I'm always very careful. I think I think the trends that we're seeing, I think, as I said, sustainability is going, if not gone, mainstream, but not just sustainability in terms of, do you recycle your waste and are you energy efficient and that kind of thing, but actually, like, what is the purpose of your organization? What is the purpose of the products and services that you provide? And do they have a place in the future of the world? And we talked last week, didn't we, Tom, about like the very extreme version of Patagonia,
great story.
Who have as their mission statement, we are in business to save the planet. Not a mention about Gore-Tex or hiking boots or anything like that. Their raison d'etre is to be a force for good in the planet. And of course, the ownership of that organization has been now turned over to a trust, so that all of the profits will be plowed into sustainable issues. That's an extreme version. Not everybody has to be that. But I do think as a CRO, you've got to look at the sustainability of your operation, of your products, of your services, and of your mission, to make sure that stays relevant for the future.
Great, thanks, Jenny. Thank you very much. And I think saving the world is a good segue to opening up to questions from the floor from everybody attending. So thank you. I'd like to thank you very sincerely, obviously, Jenny, for answering all my questions. I know there was a few extra, slightly more complex ones from last week. I thought I'd test you a little bit, so yeah. Appreciate that. So I think the chat window is available to ask questions, but you can also raise your hand and we'll unmute your mic if you want to ask a question of Jenny. I'll put myself on mute for now anyway, at least, unless there's questions for me.
The question is for you, Tom. Yeah.
Yeah.
No, but let's see. Equally, I'd love to hear from anyone on the line as to in the pyramid of risks, or what ones are coming to the fore, maybe something that we haven't mentioned. I think we've got some names now.
Okay, shall we unmute the mic there, Kate?
Debo.
Ajay Debo is asking.
Okay. Hi, Jennifer. Congratulations on writing the second book. I know it's hard, but a really good book from what I've read so far. A question from me: is there a particular size of organization that you had in mind when writing the book that this could apply to, or yes. Is it more of a startup, or is it a relatively mid-sized to large-sized organization?
Great question, and you're making me think as on my toes. So my background, Debo, I've come from some of the largest banks in the world. I segued into a large not-for-profit for a period of time, and as I mentioned it during the talk, I went somewhere where literally we had to build the risk framework from the ground up. So and some of the case studies in there, for example, there's a case study on the NHS and on sustainability in the NHS, and there's also a case study on a gaming organisation that seems to have lost its way for a period of time. So I'm trying to draw from as wide a base as possible. So I would hope that the answer is it applies to all levels to a greater or lesser extent, and that there's something there for everyone. And there's probably, through my experience, there's probably experiences from large and small companies throughout there. I don't know if you felt it spoke to one size or another.
I was really just asking that question because sometimes for larger organizations, some of these things do morph a little bit. And really, I was just interested in your viewpoint.
Yeah, of course. You again, the hope with something like this is that you can take it and kind of run with it and adapt it for your organization, and certain areas will absolutely explode out into much bigger and much more complex areas. So if you are dealing with customer data, that's going to just blow out your data privacy framework. Then you're going to need an awful lot more in there. If you are lending money, or if you're managing money, that's a different thing. If you're dealing with medical record, you will definitely take some of these and expand them as necessary, and then some may or may not be relevant at all. For example, like credit risk, if you're not lending money and so on.
Yeah, thank you.
I see another question from the chat there. Fiona asking, currently risk is a tick box exercise in my organization. What would you advise when risk is far down the list of priorities for a senior leadership team?
Great question, and that sounds a bit depressing, doesn't it? It's I think, Fiona, it's if there is a way to inject some freshness and a fresh perspective in there, I think that will always be valuable. There's nothing worse than badly designed tick box exercises, right? And because it just erodes the goodwill of people, and frankly, people will try and game the system if they don't see the point of the controls that are being designed. So I think if I don't know if it falls to you or someone in the organization, but if somebody can come in and talk about the why, if somebody can come in and point to things that really have happened either in the organization or for somebody else, and also maybe, I suppose, acknowledge if there are areas where the design is less than optimal, and say, look, like, we know that's not great. We're going to work on it. We're going to improve it. We'd like to work with you to improve the experience in this space. But actually, we're doing it because, for better or worse, it is still mitigating some of this risk, and that's why. So I think opening up a dialogue and showing as risk managers that we care and that we understand and that we're not completely deaf to concerns around sort of customer experience and user experience. I think if we can be human and show ourselves to be human and engaged and caring about that, and frankly, that we're there for the success of the organization, because without the organization, there's no point in the risk management framework. Those would be some of the techniques I think I would try and do to maybe jolt people out of the sort of the sense that it's just repetitive and drudgery and that kind of thing. It's a tough one. I feel for you.
There's another one there from Ian. One of my focuses over the last couple of years has been bringing through and supporting future generations of CROs. Could you comment on what supported you in your own development towards the role, or if easier, how you've supported others in their journey?
Great question. So I think it's probably being able to move yourself around an organization or around different organizations and see as much as you possibly can. When I think about my kind of the earlier years in my career, not through any kind of graduate program or anything like that, but I moved myself around in different roles, sort of trying to vacuum up experiences in different parts of the bank I was in, and also through different lenses. So I kind of moved from risk management into program delivery, into a chief of staff role. Over I'm talking a sort of 13-year period, to harvest as much experience as possible, and I think that's what I've tried to do with some of the junior people in my team as well. So seeing an operational risk manager grow in confidence and present to the board for the first time, albeit supported and that kind of thing. But it was incredibly gratifying for me, having a credit risk manager who had aspirations to the broader role start to dip his toe into operational and cyber risk and sit in some of those meetings and start to grow his expertise there. I think those are probably the things that I think are sort of most valid or most helpful. I think CRO, it's so broad, assuming it is covering operational risk, credit risk, market risk, cyber risk, nobody can come to that role completely fully formed. And so, you've got to try and get as much of that experience as you can, and obviously then bolster through training or through strengths across the team to make sure that you've got the expertise there. So I think as wide and diverse as possible was my experience, and I think it stood well to me.
Right, thanks. Rachel is asking, can you use that pyramid? Sorry, I have to go back. Can you use the pyramid in the context of conducting risk workshops across the organization?
So I think so, Rachel. That's kind of how I thought about it. It's in terms of it's where it's come about. It's basically if there's lists of risks all out there from consultants, from on the internet, from studies, from everything. I found that pyramid helpful to think about a sort of a sequencing of how you think about risk. And in my view, yes, you absolutely could. And again, some will be better than others. Some will be for different audiences rather than others. So you may want to think about in which audience you have a discussion about strategic risk. That's kind of a pretty sensitive one. But I find it very useful as a checklist and as a sequencing, as I say, and just to make sure that you've kind of cast the net and maybe not missed something out. So yes, that's hopefully what it's there for.
Right, and I think Craig, you worked together at Barclays Wealth when he was based in Geneva, and he's asking, I'm starting to think about how I can leverage the nudge philosophy, behavioral science approach to human risk in leading risk management across my organization. Do you have any experience and advice on this?
Yeah, it's brilliant and it's incredibly effective, isn't it? So I think when you think about a user experience or a customer experience on the screen, being able to say, X% of organizations choose this more secure option, and that kind of, or setting defaults, isn't that right? So this is the default, this is the recommended route. How many of us, when we're going through, signing up on a form or choosing something, don't go with like, this is the default, this is the recommended option. So I think nudging people in the right direction, rewarding good behavior, smart move. You've put yourself, in doing this, you've actually, moved up a notch in security. You've become more secure as an organization. We know as human beings that we respond to those nudges. We know we respond to positive reinforcement, and how much better than being kind of told off for not filling in a checklist and that kind of thing. So absolutely, Craig, I think there's tons of scope to deploy that.
And another one here. Congratulations on the book, Jennifer. As a CRO, what information do you think is most useful for you to receive, and in what format and from whom, so that you're comfortable that you're doing your best as a CRO and managing risk for the organization?
That's like, what a brilliant question. And like, if you think about it, for any role in leadership, what a great question to ask yourself, right? Who am I hearing from, and how often am I hearing from them? Am I just in a bubble of people around me who are telling me what I need to hear? How am I validating that? How often do I go out and get fresh perspective from people? How often do I go and speak with someone in a different organization or a different sector, to keep my own perspective fresh? I talk a lot about seeing the wood for the trees. It's so easy to get kind of focused in on to be on a path of remediating the issues that you see at hand. And one of the most important jobs as CRO is to stay fresh, right, and to maintain that vision and perspective. I'm not sure I have a brilliant answer in terms of like which one or how or whatever, but I think the secret is to keep it as diverse and as fresh as possible. And and it's also challenging now, isn't it, in this hybrid working space? So it used to be I'll go and visit another office, or I'll go and travel here and there, and there's still validity to that, isn't there? And there's still validity to getting people together, making an occasion of it, hearing from people, hearing from like frontline staff and so on. Actually, one anecdote I will say, one of the most powerful things when I worked in the fintech I mentioned was to get the head of our customer services team to come and talk to the product team about a customer experience. So either a really good customer experience where someone said, oh my God, you've understood my business, you've lent me money, you've made the difference between me being able to buy that stock and not buy that stock, and everybody feels amazing, right? Or a customer that like got stuck in a loop, didn't get an answer when they expected to have the answer, and what that meant for them and their business. And honestly, it just cut all of the bickering and arguing, and it just cut it flat, because this was testimony from customers. So I suppose that there's something to think about in your environment. How often do you hear from the customer experience? Because that's just gold when it happens.
Right. Okay. Thank you. I think we have time for one more question. If there's any questions for Jenny or myself, raise your hand or stick it in the chat.
You just want to grab a coffee, Tom. That's also.
We're close to the time anyway. There's only a few minutes left.
Well, so, say, Tom, sorry, just before I hand over to you, is you are going to get a copy of the book in the post, hopefully. Just make sure that you connect with Marie or your CWSI contact. For today only, the book is free on Kindle. So I have it on a promotion today. So it's free for you to buy on Kindle, and not just free if you have the Kindle subscription, but just free. So if you would like to download it today, please do so. And of course, if you like the book, in the early stages of a book, reviews count for an awful lot. So I would be very grateful if you could leave a review. But that's it from me.
Great. Thank you very much, Jenny. Really appreciate your time. Great to talk to you again. And congratulations again on the book.
Thank you for giving your time this morning, and thank you, Tom and CWSI team. I really enjoyed talking to you.
So yeah, if you want to get in touch, we'll be sending out contact details and follow up via email to every attendee, and we look forward to hopefully being in touch with you again in the future. Thanks, Jenny, again.
Thanks all. Bye.
Bye-bye.